All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're very excited to bring you a webinar on our Advocacy Benchmark Report for 2019. And the subtitle here is, how do you measure up to your peers and to yourselves, I guess, and to your industry? And we'll get into lots of that good stuff as we go along. But I've got two great panelists with me today. I'm Anne Dermody. I'm the Content Marketing Director here at Fiscal Note and CQ. And I wrote this report, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how it came about in another couple of minutes. But first I wanted to introduce my colleague Brandon Carroll, who Voter Voice clients will be very familiar with because Brandon runs our client education program for advocacy here at Fiscal Note. And also on the line we have Joshua Habursky, who you'll also be very familiar with if you join our advocacy webinars regularly. Josh is currently the Head of Federal Affairs at the Premium Cigar Association, and he's the Chairman of the Grassroots Professional Network, and he's a very seasoned practitioner in the advocacy world at this stage, having worked at, to name but a few, the American Motorcyclists Association, the Diabetes Association, and most recently ICBA, which is the Independent Community Bankers Association. So I think we're going to start with, we're going to start with me, and then we will go into Josh, and then Brandon is going to look a little more at sort of the after report to the report, if you like. So he did another piece of research from this giant piece of research we have, which is going to give you some other great tips from a practical kind of standpoint. So even though the run of order here looks like it's me, then Brandon, then Josh, we're actually going to reverse Josh, and we'll finish with Brandon. Okay, so the Fiscal Note Advocacy Benchmark Report for 2019. We'll look at the methodology. We'll talk about that a little in a minute. And then we're going to explore some of the key findings from baseline metrics, which is basically just the overall sort of averages for benchmark for email open and action rates for advocacy. Then we'll talk about sort of targeted campaigns. We'll look briefly at the Action Center action, which is sort of how folks found you and how they got to your Action Center. The message volume, we'll talk briefly about that by day and month and hour. And then finally, just a quick look at the top sectors and the industries that make them up. So the methodology, well, one thing to remember here is that we had a huge sample size. And when I mentioned that I had put together this report with our data science team, the reason this came about was when CQ merged with Fiscal Note last year, we suddenly had this huge sample size of advocacy folks thanks to Voter Voice and to CQ Engage. And we knew anecdotally that, you know, we had a lot of methods that these folks were using to really sort of excel in their advocacy campaigns. And it was sort of a passion project of mine to really start to bring those two sets of data together and really dive deep. And as it turned out, Fiscal Note has a wonderful data science team here. And so they could really collate all of these numbers and take a sort of look at what were the trends over the last 3 years in particular. So we had 2,400 organizations that we looked at, and they had a total of 76,000 campaigns, which is obviously a huge number of campaigns over 3 years. And the number of emails that were sent through those campaigns totaled 1.1 billion. So I think it's fair to say that we have a pretty good analysis to bring you here today. We looked at the information and the call to action emails, and the difference being there, of course, information emails are ones that are educational, maybe in their manner, or have sort of newsletters or things like that. And then the call to action ones are the ones where there's an ask, where people actually ask you to take action for them. And for a lot of folks listening, those will obviously be the more important ones. And Josh and Brandon will go into a little bit more how you can improve those call to action rates, right? Because ultimately, that's what everybody wants to happen. We looked at 17 sectors, and those sectors were made up of 50 industries. So, for example, if you think of health as a sector, you can have everything from medical devices to pharma organizations to professional organizations. And so we broke down those 17 sectors into 50 different industries. The one thing I will encourage you, obviously, to do is this report is free. It's the largest one out there. in that advocacy space. And so because it's free, please download it. We will include in the recording of this webinar, we'll have a link to show you how you can do that. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The other thing to remember is throughout the webinar today, you can ask questions and we'll answer them at the end. I would love this to sort of turn into a bit of a discussion with Brandon and Josh and myself. So feel free to ask questions. There's a chat box on your screen. You can just type your question in there, and we'll probably wait until the end to answer some of those. So let's start off by looking at the baseline metrics by message type. And what this is basically is the averages, right? So we know that, say in marketing, which is sort of my field, we know that the average open rate is 20.81, right? 20.81%. So that's across the board. Of any emails that are sent, the average open rate is 20.81, which is pretty high, and that's considered a pretty good open rate for anybody. In advocacy, the general open rate was 25.8, which is great, right? So we know straight away that people are engaged with your advocacy emails, and you're already kind of killing it on the average there. For calls to action, the open rate was slightly lower, but not that much. It's 24.8%. Again, a really high rate. So you're doing great things with getting those emails out there, getting them, getting attention paid for them, and getting them opened. Now you need to take that next step, obviously, and get folks to take action for you when they open them. So we also looked at campaigns by target, and by target in this case we mean were those campaigns going to federal officials, were they going to state officials, were they going to a combination of both? Obviously a lot of campaigns go to the states and also to the Hill, and then messages to others, which can include things like local lawmakers, right? So the open rate for federal officials was 23.7%, slightly less than the average overall. The messages to state officials were higher at 26.8%, the open rate there. And then the best performer, if you like, was when there was a combination of both. When campaigns included federal and state officials, the open rate there was 31.4%. However, for the actual action rates, the messages to state officials resonated most. And if you kind of keep that in mind when we get in a little deeper into sort of the month metrics, and so when most campaigns are sent and not sent, it's worth kind of remembering that higher action rate for state officials and how you might be able to sort of, I don't want to say game the system, but maybe tweak things slightly so that you could have a better state campaign and maybe at a different month in the year than most other folks are doing it. So this is data that is just for voter voice. So this is how folks found your action centers in 2018 if you're a voter voice client. 65% came by referral. Directly to your action center were 19.6%. Social drove 8.7% of folks there, and then other is 3.5%, and email is 2.8%. Now this looks really low because most people do not put a UTM, which is just a marker on their emails. So a lot of the email traffic is also folded in under referral, and that's worth kind of paying attention to because you know, if you're sending out all these emails, obviously you're getting a higher open rate or a higher landing on your action center by doing that. So briefly, just wanted to look a little bit at the action center metrics by device. No surprises here. You can see between 2017 and 2018, those numbers for mobile keep going up. Still quite a lot of folks hanging on there, looking at things on their desktop, which probably makes more sense during the working hours. And tablet seems to be kind of remaining in the same sort of spot between 8 and 9%. And we've noticed that it's sort of hovered there for the last number of years. But obviously the move to mobile means that you really have to optimize for mobile in anything you do now. Thought this was interesting. Again, this is a 2018 stat, and it's kind of interesting how the folks who landed on your action center are. We might think that women are more active in activism, if that's a way of saying it, or in advocacy. We found by action center, and again, bear in mind, this is just by action center, the folks landing on your legislative action center, not necessarily the folks taking action for you. But men were by far the bigger visitors there at 57.9%. And interestingly, the biggest visitors by age demographic were skewed older too. But again, it's important to remember here that these are not necessarily the people taking action, right? So these are just the visitors to your action center. I thought this was kind of an interesting one that I wanted to include, and without sort of, leading the conversation, I think it's kind of interesting how we all do this. So we come in on a Monday and we sort of start off slowly. And so the least number of emails got sent on Mondays. You can see there 159 million. And that slowly progressed to 233 million emails being sent by Friday. And it's interesting when you see the time it's obvious that folks are just trying to get all those emails that have built up during the week off their plate on a Friday afternoon. But it's also important to remember that you need to know your audience and not necessarily think that everyone is going to respond in the way that you are, right? So just because you send them out on a Friday doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's going to read them on a Friday, and it might be worth coming back towards the middle of the week with some of those campaign sends. Quick look at message volume. By far, March was by far the most popular month to send messages with calls to action. Again, if you think back to where we looked at the state volume, so the campaigns to state officials and how well they performed, obviously January through March is the busy season for the state sessions. But we also know from looking at some of the campaigns that our clients have run over the years that sometimes a great time to educate folks in the states is September, October, November, December, because once those state sessions start, your chances are your campaign is getting lost in the sheer volume and in the noise of everything that's happening in that very compressed time. So it's worth remembering that sometimes October, November, December are the times that some of those state legislators actually have to look at, to be educated, if you like, and to look at the sort of campaigns you're sending out. So there is some scope there to kind of mix it up a bit and not just necessarily hound, if you like, the campaigns in those really busy months in the states in particular. The monthly calls to action. So again, this is sort of just looking at the action and open rate by month. Again, you can see January's way up there in terms of open rate, and January, February, March have a very high action rate. But what's interesting about this one, to me at least, is December, right? You've got a pretty high action rate of 8.5%, and yet that is one of the months when the lowest number of campaigns get sent out. So if you look at the campaign number there, the messages with calls to action, December is a really low month, and yet the open rate's pretty high. So that may determine some of your planning in the future. And then we looked at sectors. I mentioned in the beginning that we had these 17 sectors, and we broke them down into 50 different industries. Now, if you want to see the industries up close, you'll need to download the report, because obviously I think it's like a 50-plus page report, and we couldn't share it all here, or we would be here until tomorrow. So, but this is just an overview of the sectors, and not the industries that make them up, if you like. And so you can see agribusiness there is pretty high, food and beverage, obviously, and various other ones. And so then when we looked at the actual open rates for these industries, we could see that, or for these sectors, we could see that beer, wine, and liquor, or in the food and beverage industry, had a really, really high open rate. In infrastructure, construction services had a really high open rate. Hospitality and the recreational and live entertainment sector had really high open rates. And I'm not going to go through them all, but it's interesting to see that these were the top 10 industry performers within the sectors, and obviously they have really high open rates, all of them. And then for the action rates, food and beverage again was by far the leader. It won out basically on both categories, if you like. Interesting that insurance in this state, in this example, was also really high. Gun rights and single-issue, ideological and single-issue organizations did really well in the action rates too. Not so well in the open rates. They were one of the lower ones in open rates, but in action rates, they really did well, which you can probably imagine is that folks who are engaged in a single issue are very engaged and usually very passionate about it. And now I think we're going to go over to Josh. So Josh, can you hear us? I know you're on the line there.
Fantastic. Really appreciate Fiscal Note putting together this comprehensive report. I found the information and the statistics to be very useful as a practitioner. And looking at some of the things that we've discussed on past webinars and past forums that we've hosted, I think a lot of what was purely conjecture or ideas that we as practitioners had about the industry were affirmed by this data set. And I just wanted to take the time to go through a few key takeaways that I noticed in the report and found to be pretty interesting. Looking at the overall average for open rates and action rates, seeing the distinction between the federal campaigns and the state campaigns. I mean, I think some people would think, oh, federal issues, they're more highly visible, they're more in the media, people might be more likely to take action, and that's actually not the case. We've talked about in the past the importance of localizing an issue, and I think that is, highlighted in these statistics on both the open rates and the action rates, seeing a higher action rate and open rate at the state level. And one of my own hypotheses would be, the local level would have an higher average open rate and action rate over the state and the federal. If you drilled it down even further, looking at some of the campaigns that are going on in the cities and counties across the country, that is something that jumped out at me at the report. We can go to the next slide. And then, of course, that referral traffic, as you mentioned, and seeing such a high percentage of 65.1%. And yes, it does encompass some of those other things. But I think one of my key takeaways in a future slide is really crafting and creating content that is meant to be shared. And as you mentioned, having a UTM code so you can track that information and preparing, your campaigns so that they're not just static one-to-one organization to individual outreach, that there's that blast effect where, it's going to go and it's going to spread across to other folks that are interested in an issue itself. One of the other key factors and metrics in the report was 91.77% of social media platforms drive action through Facebook. Facebook was king, and then of course everything else down the line. And I noticed Twitter was only at like 6%. So that is something that jumps out at me as a practitioner, thinking where am I going to allocate budget if I have social media resources and I really need to drive action. The options are a little more limited. And I think a lot of folks on the advertising side would want to say, all right, you should do some Twitter ads, you should do some Instagram ads and diversify a little bit. Again, it's campaign to campaign, but at large, looking at these statistics, it's hard to justify if you have such a limited budget and you're a nonprofit organization. It's hard to justify spending outside of Facebook based on the data and the results of where traffic is coming from. I think, I widen the time a little bit, and I know the report itself is a little bit more exact, but the optimal time frame being 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. to send messages. I, as a practitioner, usually will do a little bit later. Noon to 1 is within that time frame. Which is consistent with the data and the statistics from the report. But the rationale for that is if you have people on the West Coast, when they wake up, see the email, see the action alert, being cognizant of that, not just thinking about the East Coast. I know it can be very centric being in D.C., thinking, all right, I got to worry about New York and Washington, but tend to forget a little bit about some of the other parts of the country and I think the best time is around that area. And then, of course, you mentioned the most email is sent on Friday. I think a lot of that has to do, I know a lot of organizations are involved at sending like a weekly roundup or an informational message. Here's a download of what happened this week. Here's a legislative brief on all of the happenings in Washington or a state capital. And I think that's why that number is so high. A lot of organizations will have that Friday roundup. You see that it's, the lowest amount of emails are sent on Mondays, and I think the explanation from that really is that you load all of your messages on Monday. Staff is not in, or at least in Washington, the members of Congress aren't in on Mondays. That's kind of the travel day, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's when a lot of the meetings are going on Capitol Hill. So you want to combine your grassroots efforts with your direct lobbying efforts, having those messages sent and having the people take action Tuesday through Thursday makes a lot of sense. And I think that stat and that piece of information is really telling of how it actually is in the field. And then I thought it was really interesting that lawyers and lobbyists are more active on email in August. So it's kind of a time to catch up during the August recess. If you're not traveling or on vacation, that sector is very active during that time frame. And I think, again, that's consistent with the real world. And that's when you see, multiple stats from the report that you really look at and analyze in the real world and kind of dissect and not just a number. And when they're all adding up, it's the sign of a quality benchmark report. And I think that's what we see here. We can go to the next slide. About half of campaigns have a call to action. I think that's a really interesting stat. Again, a lot of them are informational messages that are sent, updates, briefs, here's what's going on. I think that as, you see there's 365 million advocacy emails that occurred in 2018. I would think that stat on half of the campaigns having a call to action in the years to come, that will increase a little bit because you're going to have to utilize email more to actually drive action. I think 60% to 40% is where the future will be with that, just based on that. You're going to have to send those informational messages, but again, with all of the other factors and all of the other organizations competing for the time and attention of advocates, you're going to have to get that message in front of them in other ways and kind of tweak your strategy as you go. You might be a part of, a trade association. You might be a contributor to a nonprofit or a foundation, and you're getting all these different messages, advocacy messages. So you're really competing over those individuals and getting them to activate. 6,358 federal campaigns in 2018. Again, that's really interesting from my perspective, from the competitive sense, that obviously this is a huge sampling of the advocacy community and the largest that Fiscal Note, Voter Voice, and CQ put together. But when you add some of the other campaigns that are going on out there, plus this, just the volume is massive, and it really puts it into context here. Next slide. So some things of analysis and things to consider. Of course, volume is increasing significantly. As I mentioned before, I think content will need to be very distinct, unique, and hyper-focused to the individual advocates. I think that, from my own perspective and something that I want to try based off of reading this report, want to try communicating outside of a Friday or peak time to try to test open and action rates. And even that 10 to 3 window, throw a curveball to kind of see where it lands up, or if there's any distinction there. Go kind of against the grain to see if there's a significant increase or a significant drop to kind of test it out. And then develop content with the intention of referral traffic in mind. I think that's critically important. And then from these stats, and I'd be interested to hear from the other presenters on this, consider withholding some budget on Twitter and Instagram campaigns as it relates to advocacy, just based off of that information. I've always been hesitant and kind of a skeptic on some of these advertising campaigns through the social media platforms and the effectiveness and return on investment. But unless I'm looking at these statistics wrong, that's something that jumps out at me as a practitioner. Next slide, please. And then consider peer-to-peer email campaigns. I think that that's something that again, you're looking for to increase the open rates and the action rates. There are only so many things that you can do, and I think one of the main things is utilizing people that are existing resources, that are familiar, that are voices within your subset of a community to get them to be involved and activate their peers. So that's something that I think is a key takeaway that you can see from the data. Utilize local and state email banners. That's something that I've done all the way going back to my work at the American Motorcyclists Association, where we had, and running state campaigns, we would have a state web banner on CQ Engage at the time, and sending messages through our email system using a state banner as well. So that was a way that we would localize it, again, to see if we can get that increase in action and open rates. Evaluate overall communications plan and coordinate with the fuller organization. Again, looking at volume, I think volume is crazy, from this study and from others, but put that in the context that, if you have a membership department or a fundraising department or a PAC department or whatever, how many times is your organization emailing an organization, doing an email audit and just figuring out, all right, let's coordinate all of the different departments and figure out, how many messages are going out to what audience, and kind of create a map of who's getting what. If you don't have that already in place, or like a master list of email messages, that is really worth it. And I know a lot of small nonprofits don't do that. It's kind of, all right, we're going to kind of figure out how to play air traffic controller with these email messages as we go, but it's something that requires some forward thinking and looking at it in a holistic manner. Two of the questions that I have as a result of looking at this analysis: how much are these statistics influenced by other departments in the organization outside of advocacy and government affairs? I think that this is critically important data, and Fiscal Note did a great job on it. But my thought process is, how is the communications and marketing departments in an association affecting these stats altogether? Where does it all mesh? And how necessary is it to craft social media messages for calls to action beyond Facebook? As a practitioner, those are the two things that jumped out at me, and hopefully we can get some further insights on those. And then, a few additional tips and tricks there. Again, I mentioned rotate the signatory, include a call to action on the first and last and hyperlink in the center of it. This is just, some basic email tricks that Ann and I have talked about in past webinars and some different articles. If the goal of the message is action, then don't hide it. Use action words and pepper your content with the link to act. Don't bury the link and don't bury the action. It's great to have a high open rate, but if folks aren't doing anything with the message, you're really putting a lot of time and effort for naught. Don't include multiple different actions in one message. Keep it simple, quick, and easy. I am on listservs of organizations that ask me to do 10 things in one message. I'm cognizant as a grassroots professional of the strategy and the focus and what is necessary in it. As an average, if I was an average person outside of government relations, just involved in an organization or association, it would be really problematic for me to decipher and find out which of the 10 things I should do and what's the level of importance. You're not going to get the most devout person to do all of those 10 things within that window of time. It is not a good way of processing that information. And segment your list frequently and even purge the list. Create an always send group. So that group of people that are most active, make sure that you're sending everything so that they're aware. A lot of times that will include like a board of directors and some key advocates. But don't be afraid to, get rid of a list that hasn't been doing too much for you, or at least put it on a dormant and then you work on some reactivation efforts as you go. There we go.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Really good tips there, and thanks for that insight about the Hill and how folks, particularly advocacy practitioners, send out their newsletters and their roundups on Fridays. That makes a lot of sense, obviously, in the context of all those emails going out. So I'm going to turn things over to Brandon now, and he's going to talk a little more about kind of best practices from this sort of secondary piece of research that we did following on from the Advocacy Benchmark webinar. So I'll turn it over to you, Brandon.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And Josh, I really appreciate your time and a lot of the great insight you shared, because a lot of the data that I'm about to share with everyone here supports some of those tips and tricks that you had just mentioned. And so, our team of data scientists, the PhDs, we didn't just stop at here's the benchmarks by sector, by industry. We took it a step further and we asked some concrete questions, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But as Josh mentioned, right, we have all these emails, people are inundated. I think it's the stat, something like 263 million emails are sent every day, or 263 billion, and by 2022 it's expected to grow to 333 billion per day, right? So how do you stand out? Your cause is super important to them, but they're sifting through hundreds of emails per person per day, right? And so people are overwhelmed. Their attention spans are smaller. We know for a fact through data, and I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, that the shorter the email, the better, right? Don't ask for too much. Josh had just mentioned, don't ask for 10 things. Ask for one thing and make sure it's concrete and it's simple for them to understand and to act. If you do ask them to take action, do it early in the email, right? Don't require the reader, the advocate, to read the entire email before seeing a button or seeing a link to take action. Do it early, versus later, and I'll talk about that as well. And not all emails should necessarily go to all contacts, right? Segmentation is super important. One thing also to note is people are overwhelmed, as I mentioned. Sending a follow-up asking them to take action, which you can do both through Engage and in Voter Voice, is okay, and it's something we recommend, and you're going to see an increase in action rates by doing that. So when we took that kind of data science there to the next level, we said, here's some questions we thought through, and some of this Ann already went over. What constitutes a good open action rate for your sector, right? What time of day and month of the year will garner your campaign the most attention, and how long should your email be, right? How many links should you include in your email? Does the placement of the call to action matter? Another important thing to note is we looked at data in terms of the urgency of the message, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit of a framework you can use when you're writing a message that will lead to a higher action rate. So without further ado, I want to first start, right, as Ann mentioned, for 10,000 emails sent, which I believe is the average, 2,480 are open, 213 advocates take action. I want to qualify that number because, it's the pros and cons of having a billion emails and 2,400 organizations doing 70,000+ campaigns. Some organizations, it might take 2,000 emails or 1,000 emails to get 213 advocates. Others, it may take 40,000 or 50,000. Really is dependent on the cause, the organization, the ways your members are organized within your organization. And so I just want to make sure I have that qualified statement around this number of 213. Regardless of that, I want to help you figure out ways on improving whatever your action rate is, the number of people who take advocates per send. And so we talked about time and day of the week, right? Josh had mentioned 10 to 3. It's around 10 to 3, 10 to 4. We find 11 to 4 is also a good time, really just during the workday, right? It's more predictable and less risky. There's also some opportunity at around 9 to 10 p.m. So we actually look at action rates per time just as a standalone factor, and we saw that it can influence rates for up to 10%. So if you send an email, on a Wednesday at 10 a.m. local time, it's going to have a considerable more action than an email sent at 5 p.m. local time, right? And so during the week, Josh had mentioned Tuesday through Thursday. Thursday is also in there. I would say earlier in the weeks the better, right? You don't want to do Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Again, that makes intuitive sense. But if you have done that in the past and you change that up, you can see action rates improve by up to around 15%. So there's a very large influence in terms of meeting people where they are and when they're actually reading their emails. Otherwise, because they're so inundated with so many new emails coming into their inbox, your email is now at the bottom of that email, their email list, so they might miss it. That's why you want to hit them kind of when they're actually reading and in their emails. All right, so the next thing here is, and this is a really important distinction, right? The shorter emails perform better, right? This highlights the 10 pieces of email asks that Josh had mentioned as a practitioner. Is you can see this line, this linear line here that goes down. That's a very good thing from a data science standpoint. What that tells us is if you have a shorter email that's very concrete, succinct, to the point, you're going to have a much higher propensity, a much higher likelihood that your advocates are going to take action versus a long email. And I always joke, and I put that back to you, and it's like, have you ever got an email that's really long? Earlier in my career, I used to send these long emails to the management team until finally one of them had the ability to give me some feedback and say, hey, can you try to be a little bit more succinct in what you're saying? And that really opened up my eyes to say, yeah, I was thinking just throwing everything I wanted to at you without thinking of you as the recipient of that email and how that would resonate and if that would be easy for you to understand. I think there's a very important lesson there. And so that's a very important note. When you're thinking of your email length, you want to be very to the point, right? We look at that trend line. That can actually increase it up to 25%. It has one of the highest levels of correlation in terms of action is the length of the email. It makes intuitive sense, but it's a very, very impactful action that you can take in your emails right now to try to see and test for your advocates if that's going to improve and increase action. Right, we know that the less links perform better. Where it says 0, to give some context and just as a quick caveat, when you send an email through Voter Voice and you don't include a call to action button, it's going to automatically insert that at the bottom. That's included in the 0 to give, so at least means 1. But essentially 1 to 2 call to action links are going to perform better. There's a really good book I read years ago called The Paradox of Choice, which is also talks about this phenomena where, if we overload people with too many things, we're asking them to do too much, to click too many times, too many things on a menu. If you go to a restaurant, we get paralyzed and we make no choice. We do inaction. We want to remove it out of our site because it's too paralyzing, because it's too much. This data supports that concept as well. So less calls to action. Again, the more specific and targeted and hyper-targeted you are, the better, right? Sending a clear and concise email with 1 to 2 call to actions at most does have an impact of up to 10%. When I talked to the data science team, I said, how much does this specific thing standing alone impact action rates? And it can be up to 10%. So something important to note here as well, as we're looking at kind of taking this advocacy benchmark report and saying, how do we take this to the next level to provide very tactical guidance, prescriptive guidance to those advocacy professionals using our software. The next thing here is where you place the link. I want to explain what this means here. 0 means at the top of the email. 1 means at the bottom of the email. As you can see here, as you go down the email, you have a less likelihood to action, right? You have upwards around 10%, bottom here around 8%. It's about 20% difference there in terms of action in the upper and lower bound there for these emails. So if you were to do 1 to 2 action alert email kind of calls to action, do it in the beginning, early, with maybe a sentence to explain the why. I'm emailing you today for this specific purpose. Take action with a link, and then maybe supportive information below that with another call to action, a summary, and then kind of that's it, right? You don't necessarily want to put them at the bottom. You really do want to put them towards the top and or the middle versus the bottom, right? It can impact up to 15% is what we found. Again, you can see this delta here in terms of how much that can impact just by moving your link up as something to test for you is what we would recommend. Moving forward, right, to kind of summarize this, if you're thinking of utilizing these additional findings, these very tactical prescriptive guidance here, right, on average for every 10,000 advocates sent a broadcast, 2,480 will open it, 213 will take action. If you send an email at a specific time of day that we would recommend, 11 to 4, say 10 to 3, 10 can be in there as well, or 9 to 10 p.m. Again, 9 to 10 is going to be more risky because it has a high upper bound, which means that there's been times people have sent emails at that time and it's worked really well. There's also been times people have sent it and no one's responded. So you can see up to a 10% bump. Again, I always say it's worth testing. So test and iterate would be my recommendation as a practitioner as well as an educator. Is every organization's advocates are different. So if something's working for you and you're well above the benchmarks, then maybe not. You don't need to change a lot. But if you're saying, hey, we want to improve, I would say start testing some of these specific changes that you can do and see the impact it has on your open and action rates. Day of week, sending earlier in the weeks the better, up to about a 15% bump. Emails under 250 words, up to a 25% bump. 1 to 2 action links at most, up to 10%, and an action link listed early is up to a 15%. So these are very specific to your needs, things you can do today to try to improve your action rates amongst your advocates, right? So you add all those up and you're starting to really get this number to 400 to 500 advocates rather than 200 very quickly, which to me is super exciting because my job is to help you all get the more value out of the software you're already using here within the Fiscal Note Advocacy Suite. And so another thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned follow-up, and this is a very big impact on action rates, is the ability within one click within Voter Voice, you can also do this with Engage, of boosting response rate or action rate, right, by 20%. And so when you send an email, and this is an example here for the Arthritis Foundation, after you send an email within Voter Voice, for instance, you can actually click track and resend. And what that does here, is you were to click one of these here, and it will automatically identify non-responsive supporters. So people who either opened the email and did not take action or did not open the email, and it will send them a follow-up request for action. Our recommendation there would be to change your message so that it's more compelling or presents the information differently. And you can see upwards around 20%. And as I mentioned earlier, right, advocates are overwhelmed. They're inundated with email. It might go to the bottom. They do want to take action. It might be way down in their email. It might be on page 2, right, of their email inbox in Gmail, right? And so you were to click the email here. It'll show you, hey, 80% did not respond. You can send what's called a reminder here, where only the recipients who have not responded will be used. You can also do a thank you to send maybe a thank you email to the folks who did respond, or a follow-up as to everybody who matched the original criteria, regardless of if they responded. So you can do this inside of Voter Voice very simply within one click. If you were to do this inside of Engage, there is ways to do that within the communications tool to filter by action or activity, and then find that new list or create that new list and send them a follow-up email that may look something like this. Again, it doesn't have to be this insanely large email with all kinds of imagery, especially in a follow-up email. You want it to be succinct and to the point. I can tell you definitively, in my 6 years doing email marketing now, this email right here, something as simple as this as a follow-up, is going to at least get a 20% increase in my response rate. I know that because even my Voter Voice webinars that I've done, I send a follow-up email asking the folks if they're going to be there that didn't respond, and I see my numbers of webinar registrants go way up. And that's just a very small microcosm of my experience here. In my career, emails that are very succinct and to the point, that have one call to action as a follow-up to the initial email that we know they're interested in, you're going to get a lot of activity, more than you might think. I would encourage you to try it if you have not been doing this already. So I wanted to send you a quick follow-up. First and foremost, thank you so much for attending the fly-in earlier this week. Please take a few minutes to let us know how your meetings went with your legislators via the link below. In this example, this is a custom survey we might have done for all the folks who attended the fly-in. This email would only go to the folks who did not complete the survey, right? And so that's a very powerful segment of contacts that we're sending a very targeted email to. So track and resend is that, again, that an additional lift of another 20%, which is easily able to do within Engage and in Voter Voice. Right, so just to recap that, it's shown to increase action rates by 20%. People are busy and overwhelmed. And one thing when I've talked to some of these organizations, whether it's a regional chamber or the Arthritis Foundation or the different clients that we have, is there is some apprehension sometimes to say, hey, I don't know if I want to overly bug people. I know advocates have a lot going on, but they're a part of your organization. They care about the cause in some form, and it's okay to remind them. I wouldn't say to abuse it, of course, but doing it once or even twice, especially if it's an urgent and important issue, it's not the worst thing to do, especially as long as you frame it appropriately, right? So I've noticed there's kind of like this mental block to say, I don't want to overdo it, but that's why I would say make the email very succinct, very easy for them to read and digest, and very easy for them to act, and that's okay to do. So I just wanted to highlight that specific point. In terms of what to say, so we get asked this a lot, what do I actually say in the message? Just a simple framework to follow here is consequence, metric, timeline, right? So when you're thinking of the framing of the message, the consequence, what happens if they do or do not take action? Metric, how large of an impact is it going to have, or what level of impact is it going to have? And the timeline, when do they need to act by? Or when is the issue going to go into effect to impact them? Or when is the thing going to happen? And I always like to use an example of like sequoia trees, right? Sending an email that asks someone, even in the subject line, save the trees, is probably not going to get a lot of opens and action. Whereas an email that might mention 10,000 sequoia trees to be cut down next week, right? That sort of mentality of the sense of urgency is going to have higher action because it's specific. Again, we're using consequence, metric, timeline. So when you're framing your communication and framing your messages, think, how do I make the email short? How do I make it to the point? How do I have one call to action? Abiding by the framework here to write the right message of following consequence, metric, and timeline. Right? So just to recap, right, we talked through the advocacy benchmark report where it provides tactical ways for you to increase your open and action rates, right? And did a ton of work with our data science team to give that report, and we're going to be, we have those V2 learnings, the kind of version 2 learnings that we're really excited that we shared a little ahead of time. I know the graphs there aren't pretty, but we'll get there. And then the track and resend we talked about, or sending a follow-up, allows you to send a reminder email and increase action rate by up to 20%. And then lastly is when you're thinking of message best practices, following the consequence, metric, timeline framework when crafting your messages will make it so that you have a higher action rate and a higher open rate. One thing to note in support of that as well is our data science team did look at the style of writing. So one of the things they're actually still analyzing, but they did find conclusively that having this type of framework will impact action rates. When you have a sense of urgency in your emails, that does impact action. And so I don't have the hard data, but they know that it is impactful, but that's just something to be mindful of as a support of this messaging best practice. Last thing, and then we'll open up for questions and conversation, is these are averages of what we talked about, not the end-all be-all. I just want to make the very important point here that every organization is different, so understanding your personal benchmarks historically is a really important thing to do. Always test. right? Not all of this is going to apply to your advocates. I just got an email from the Connecticut CPA Association where he said my open rates are above 30% for informational emails on Friday afternoons. And I said, that's awesome. Then then just keep doing that. That's really good. Right now, your members are also used to that consistency he's doing. Rome wasn't built in a day, so take these key learnings and implement them slowly, especially if this seems a little overwhelming. You don't have to do it all at once. Maybe just start with writing a shorter email. And then times have changed, right? So it's important to adapt to changing times, right? Attention spans are smaller and smaller. And so the times have changed, so how you reach out to your advocates should as well. And so with that, we have about 8 minutes for questions and conversation. Please feel free to write in the question box there anything that you'd like us to review or to go over. We're open to any questions you have there.
Great. Thank you, Brandon, and thanks, Josh. Hopefully you're still on the line. We don't have that much time, sadly, for questions, but if we don't get to your question, we'll take note of it and we'll follow up with you. But a couple of folks did ask what the buttons on the earlier slides were for, particularly the yellow, I think, and the orange ones. The yellow ones are the unsubscribe rates, so those are, the number of folks who saw your email in their inbox and decided that the content wasn't relevant for them, and so they asked to be taken off your email list. And then the failure rate is just another word for the bounce rate. So that happens sometimes if you've got a lot of older emails that are no longer valid in your database or in your list, and so they're bouncing back. So hopefully that clarifies things up. The other thing was a couple of questions about whether we'd be sharing the slides afterwards. Yes, we will. We will send the recording probably tomorrow, so as long as you're registered, you'll get that in an email tomorrow. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of randomly go through a couple of these things. What is the practitioner's, so this is obviously for you, I think, Josh, what is the practitioner's thoughts on using an email with video calling for action?
I think it's a good idea. I think that adding, any interactive components to an email is a good thing to do. Keep it very short, though. I think the likelihood of somebody watching the whole thing, whether it be directed towards advocates or even if you're trying to send something to members of Congress, has to be short and sweet. I'm a big proponent of anything that is interactive or visual.
Okay, great. Thanks, Josh. Another quick question here. What's the ideal email length? Is there a suggested word count? Maybe I'll toss that to you, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, we know for a fact as long as it's under 250 words, that's where that kind of, we would call diminished returns. In other words, if you have an email well over 250 words, you're going to see a difference. Whereas if you have it under 250 words and all of your emails were over 250 words historically, you also will see a difference, and that way it'll be positive. So we do recommend keeping it under 250 words. Is kind of a good baseline for you to aim for when you're writing and crafting these messages.
Okay, another quick question. Can or should we A/B test during the weekend? Well, I would say it's always good to A/B test. The weekend, you're probably not going to have a huge amount of volume anyway, right? So we saw that those numbers had dropped off at the weekend. So that may not be your best time to start A/B testing if you want to get a really clear result. And I think that leads us to that other thing that Brandon, you pointed out too, where we saw this sort of pickup in emails at 9 and 10 p.m. at night, and that sort of speaks to really knowing your demographic again. If you've got if you're the Humane Society, that might be the time when people like looking at, Instagram or Facebook or whatever it is, or looking at emails where they're more willing to take action while they're sitting on the couch at home, versus maybe if you're in a trade association or professional society where people are very much kind of at their computers during the day and they're more likely to take action then. So knowing your demographic is really important. And I think the other thing to remember is when you're messaging is separating out your grassroots from your grass tops, right? So the really engaged folks are likely to be your grass tops, and they may be more responsive anyway. So, those are all things you can kind of experiment with beyond even the A/B testing. Somebody else asked about referral campaigns. How do you, Josh, I guess we'll toss this one to you. Do you have any tips for getting folks to share your call to action emails, I guess, and your social postings?
Yeah, there's a couple different tools out there, free, and then there are some premium tools that you can create different links where people just click one button and it will automatically populate into, it will automatically share a pre-written post on social media. I know that Voter Voice and CQ have in-house tools there that also help with the social sharing components where you can write those messages right in there. I think a lot of times when we're talking referral links, because from my standpoint, a lot of times I would send out the alert to our advocate database, but I would also create the link for the action alert in Voter Voice and then send it to our communications department, which would also send it into our other newsletters and our other different communications that were going out. So using those like referral tools, once you have the link from Voter Voice or CQ Engage, that would be important where that step comes in.
Okay, great. I'm going to bunch a couple of them into one with this last question. So is it helpful to have pictures in your emails, and how does HTML affect the open and action rate? And did you find anything about the look of an email besides the word count and the content? So maybe, Brandon, you'd start off with that.
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal question there, Jessica and Britt as well. I appreciate your all's time here. So HTML in plain text, we didn't see a huge difference, but we did find, general best practice when you're writing emails would be to use a button as a way to do the call to action. So you can easily build buttons and make that into a link. So using words like take action now or something like that with the button, you want the button not to have a ton of text. But in terms of using pictures in HTML, I would recommend, again, trying to test that. I've seen in my career, but that was the last few years was more in the relationship marketing space, whereas plain text might work a little bit better, but it's worth testing, right? So it's one of those things where I would split your advocates in half and send one with the plain text that's a button, and then maybe one with a little bit more imagery with a button. But there's not a huge difference from the data that shows between plain text and HTML at a holistic level, but it's something we could also explore further. And then in terms of the look of the email before word count and content, typically I've always found that if you tell them what the issue is, tell them why it's important, and tell them how to take action, kind of in that order, it's a good way to kind of think about your email. And in terms of actually the look and feel or the structure of it for them to take action. Everything should kind of almost funnel down to easily take action, and then you want there to be as little friction as humanly possible when they go to actually take action. But I hope that answers your question there, Britt. Is there anything else you would add to that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I have noticed sort of in the course of my career here how the sort of best practices idea went from almost always including a picture to or some visual to that sort of not being the norm now or the most prescribed thing. And I think that might be just to the sheer overload of images and Instagram and all those things that we're kind of overwhelmed, that we almost like things, like we said, shorter and simpler. And we're just at 3 o'clock, so I'm very conscious of people's time. Thanks again to Brandon Carroll from the Customer Education Program, to Josh Habursky, who's on the line, and to everybody who joined today. I know this was a webinar that had a lot of interest, and so we appreciate your time. And again, I encourage everybody to download the report. So thanks again, everyone, and we will see you next time.